The alley behind Bleecker Street reeked of decay and forgotten souls, a narrow canyon of shadows where the city tossed away what it didn't want to acknowledge. Broken glass shimmered like cheap rhinestones under the solitary, flickering streetlight, and the wind carried the distant, mournful cry of sirens, a grim soundtrack to the thumping bass leaking from a club 3 blocks over. It was the kind of place where bad things happened to invisible people, and nobody bothered to ask questions afterward. Ghost Rickards had been crashing in that alley for 11 long months. At 58 years old, his face was a roadmap of hard living etched deep into cracked leather, and his eyes. Those eyes had witnessed too much war, too much loss, too much of the darkness humans inflict on one another. His beard was long and tangled, streaked with grey. His clothes, a patchwork of salvaged fabric held together by grit and fading memories, and everything he owned, was crammed into a battered shopping trolley he guarded like a dragon guards its hoard. To anyone just passing through, he was just another homeless military vet. Another shattered fragment of humanity, left behind by the system. Before we ride on, if you believe in brotherhood, in unwavering loyalty, and in the fundamental idea that no one should be left to rot. Then slam that like button, drop a comment, share this story far and wide, and subscribe to this channel. Tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Stories like this are a stark reminder that family isn't always blood. Sometimes, family is forged in chrome and fire. What nobody knew, what Ghost had concealed for years, was the faded tattoo emblazoned across his chest. A death's head with wings, the indelible mark of a Hell's Angel. He'd earned his colors 3 decades ago, had ridden shoulder to shoulder with some of the most legendary brothers in the club's history. But life had a cruel way of breaking even the toughest men. His wife succumbed to cancer, his son OD'd, his business went belly up, and somewhere in that downward spiral of grief and booze, Ghost had lost himself. He'd walked away from the club, not because they abandoned him, but because he couldn't bear to let them see the wreckage he had become. He'd been Ghost for so long, that sometimes he almost forgot he'd ever been anything else. The crew found him just after midnight on a Tuesday. There were 5 of them, young punks with dead eyes and cruel smirks, preying on these streets like vultures seeking easy scores. Their leader was a cocky 23-year-old named Deuce, who deluded himself into thinking that violence equaled power, and that brutalizing the weak somehow made him strong. They'd been drinking, smoking, whipping themselves into that familiar frenzy, where empathy dies, and only the ravenous hunger for destruction remains. The homeless guy in the alley looked perfect for their twisted game, old alone, nobody who would be missed. Deuce kicked over Ghost's shopping trolley first, sending his meager possessions tumbling across the damp concrete. The others laughed, a harsh, hollow sound that echoed in the night. Ghost woke with a jolt, confusion clouding his eyes, quickly replaced by a weary resignation. He'd been beaten down before, he knew what was coming. He tried to scramble to his feet, tried to at least face them standing tall. But a steel-toed boot slammed into his ribs before he could even rise. Then another, then a flurry of fists. The 5 of them took turns, treating this old man like a human punching bag, like some twisted entertainment for a dead-end night. Ghost didn't scream, didn't beg. He just curled up tight, bracing for the inevitable, the way he had waited for everything to end for so many years now. When they finally grew bored with their sadistic game, Deuce leaned down and spat in Ghost's face. He called him trash. He sneered that nobody cared about losers like him. He bragged that he could snuff him out right there, and the world wouldn't even flinch. Then they swaggered away, their laughter fading into the night, leaving Ghost bleeding in the alley, surrounded by the scattered ruins of his life. But they'd made one fatal mistake. In their drug-fueled frenzy, they'd torn Ghost's shirt. And a woman walking her dog at the far end of the alley had glimpsed something just before she dialed 911. She'd seen the tattoo on his chest, the death's head with wings. She knew what that symbol meant. Everyone in this city knew. The call went out within the hour. 72 hours later, Deuce was in the ratty basement of an abandoned warehouse his crew used as a headquarters, counting the spoils from a liquor store heist and feeling like a goddamn king. The building was their fortress, tucked away in the industrial district where cops rarely patrolled, and civilians knew better than to wander. He heard the sound first, a low rumble, like distant thunder. But it didn't fade away. It grew and grew and grew, until the walls began to vibrate, and the windows started rattling in their frames. One of his boys scrambled upstairs to check it out, and came back down with a face drained of color. His voice was trembling when he muttered that they needed to see this right now. Deuce bounded up the stairs to the ground floor and peered out the grimy window. His blood turned to ice. The street was gone. The parking lot was gone. Every inch of visible space was swarming with motorcycles, Harleys as far as the eye could see, hundreds upon hundreds of them, engines idling in a synchronized growl that sounded like the earth itself was roaring in anger. And astride those bikes, clad in leather and patches and expressions of glacial fury, were more Hell's Angels than Deuce had ever imagined existed in one single place. 2,000 riders, from 12 different charters spanning 4 states. They'd descended from everywhere, dropping everything, riding through the night, because one of their brothers had been violated. At the head of the formation, a hulking man with a grizzled beard and enforcer patches dismounted his bike. His name was Hammer Reyes, and he'd ridden with Ghost Rickards for 15 years. He'd never stopped searching for his lost brother, and when the call came, when he learned what had transpired, he'd mobilized every connection, every favor, every brother who had ever known Ghost. Hammer strode to the warehouse door and kicked it open like it was made of cardboard. Deuce and his crew shrank back against the wall, suddenly acutely aware of how young they were, how insignificantly small they were, how utterly and hopelessly outmatched they were. Hammer spoke in a voice like gravel being pulverized. He declared that they had harmed someone who belonged to them, someone they had sought for years to reclaim, someone who, despite everything, was still family. He warned that in his world, that kind of debt had to be paid in full. Deuce stammered, tried to offer excuses, tried to claim they didn't know. Hammer silenced him with a glare that could stop a freight train. He spat that ignorance was no excuse. He bellowed that Ghost Rickards had served his country for 20 years, had buried a wife and a son, had fallen further than any man should ever have to fall, and instead of offering him a helping hand, instead of showing basic human decency, they had beaten him like an animal for sport. The warehouse swarmed with brothers, encircling the crew, cutting off every avenue of escape. But there would be no mindless bloodshed. That wasn't how this would unfold. Instead, Hammer spelled out precisely what was going to transpire. Every member of this crew would turn themselves in to the police for aggravated assault. They would confess every detail. They'd serve whatever time the courts dished out. And when they got sprung, they'd carve out new lives far away from this city. Because if any of them ever dared to come back, if any of them ever laid a hand on another vulnerable soul, 2,000 brothers would remember. He laid it all out. Every hustle these punks had touched, every corner they'd worked, every connection they thought they had, was gone. Calls had been made, messages delivered, by sunrise. They'd be staring at nothing. Deuce wanted to argue and wanted to throw down. But gazing at that ocean of leather and rage surrounding him, a cold truth slammed into him. He finally understood what real power looked like, and it had jack to do with roughing up some old-timer in an alley. The crew folded. Every last one of those 5 walked out of that ratty basement and handed themselves over that very night, spilling their guts about everything, scared stiff to do anything else. And Ghost Rickards? Hammer found him in the hospital, patched up and busted, but clinging to life. He sat by his brother's bedside, gripped his hand tight, and for the first time in years, Ghost wept, not from the pain, from the gut-wrenching realization that he'd never truly been alone, that the family he thought he'd walked away from had never stopped searching, that that the death's head wings he'd earned 3 decades back still meant something. 3 months down the road, Ghost stood tall in the clubhouse, clean, sober, and rocking his cut for the first time in a decade. His brothers had hooked him up with an apartment, a gig, and something worth more than gold. They'd handed him back his soul. Because in the Hells Angels, you don't get cut loose just because you stumble. You don't fade away just because you lose your bearing. Brotherhood's about showing up when it matters most, and it always matters most when someone's drowning. And before we wrap this up, we've got a special ask. Drop a comment down below. 2 simple words. Brotherhood forever. Let us know you get what true loyalty means, because Ghost Rickard spent years in the shadows, convinced he was invisible, convinced he'd been wiped from the record, convinced he had nothing left. He was dead wrong. And somewhere out there, someone you know might be wrestling with the same demons, someone who's taken a spill, someone who thinks nobody gives a damn, someone waiting for a spark, a sign they still matter. Maybe, just maybe, you could be that spark. Because sometimes, salvation doesn't rain down from above. Sometimes it roars in on 2,000 bikes, 2,000 brothers who never forgot your name. Brotherhood forever, family always, no one left behind.